Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to get started. My name is Madeline. I'm with Simcoe County for Palestine. We're co-hosting tonight's event with Simcoe County KAIROS. And I'm going to pass it over to my friend Jeff Monague, who's going to open us. Do you want a microphone?
Good evening, everyone. Myiingan Minonaakwhe Yuda Nakang Yuenong Nakang Yuda Tek Nis Chindising Asian Kadek Nongum Yuda Edben Dogsian. So I belong to a place called called Christian Island in English, and also the Beausoleil First Nation. And I belong to that little patch of land over there. That little patch of land, that reserve. And I think I've lived much of the experience that we're going to be seeing tonight. And in Canada, you always tend to think that that's not what's happening, because in Canada, you also don't acknowledge that there's a genocide happening. Just like this unacknowledged genocide that's happening right now. But there have been a few instances of this here on this land that we came to call the Turtle Island. We begin back when the early explorers came into what became Newfoundland, Labrador, and there were people there called the Beothuk. Look it up online. The Beothuk are no longer here. They were one of the first ones that were exterminated, a complete genocide. And people always say there never was a genocide in Canada. But you can't find a Beothuk person anymore. You can find little references of them online. If you do go online, you'll find the writings of the last couple of Beothuk, two young women who were taken in by an Englishman. And he helped them and he wrote down their language, and that's the last they know of it. But it was very similar to a language that I speak, because I can go online and I can look at that and I can see words that I know. So they were our cousins. We would have been able to communicate. We would have been able to understand one another. And then as things progressed and people flowed down into the St. Lawrence River, down into the Great Lakes region, and into our region here, in between here and the Blue Mountains, there were people known as the Béton. The Béton. The English have come to call them the Petun, or Petun even. I've heard that. But we know them as the Béton. That's what they told us they were called. That's what they preferred to be called. I say that's what everything's in the past tense because they're no longer here either. And that happened right here in this territory. And nobody ever acknowledges that. Nobody ever wants to look at that those things actually occurred here. That story is buried. That's why it's important to do the things that we're doing. So the story of what's taking place today doesn't happen that way. So I grew up knowing about them. I grew up knowing a lot about them because I was told a lot about them by my elders, my parents, and how they aren't here anymore. I used to go into history classes at schools here and listen to teachers talking about the history of this land, and they'd always leave that out. And I'd bring it up. And I'd get thrown out of class. And that happened right here. So we want to acknowledge that before we start this evening. We want to acknowledge that all of those things that we're going to see actually happen here too. And this is not a competition. This is just to tell you that it was here too. That we can even look here. And we can draw from that. When we want to draw from a real story, we can draw from that. And we can accept that that story took place, and then we can acknowledge that that story took place, and then we can use that story. And we can tell people that there's a danger that we're witnessing the loss of a people. That's hard to think about. So I'm going to acknowledge our 4 directions. In my culture, we understand that the 4 doorways are protected and they're guarded by spirits. And also other places like the water, the earth, and we also talk to the Creator, God, however you understand that to be. I believe in spirituality, however you may understand it, whatever brings you closer to a Creator, and that's a good thing for human beings. I was raised a Christian. I came to know late in life about our ways, and I came to understand who I was. Because what I was supposed to be forgotten. But it's not. So I'll face the east and acknowledge that spirit that's looking after that eastern doorway, where everything starts anew. All those new things, like the children that are born to us, those young ones that are just learning about life, learning about themselves, their own body. So you see a baby holding their hand up, wondering what the heck are these things? And they hold their feet up in the same way. Experiencing this thing that we're given, this life that we're given for the first time. And it's a beautiful thing. We acknowledge the southern doorway. And that spirit that's looking after that doorway. And all those warm winds that come to us and give us what we are sitting in now, the summer. And experiencing all the good things that it can bring to us, the bounty. We are in Demolitions in my language, the strawberry moon. Named so because this is when the strawberries come to us and become part of us, and this is the heartberry. Demon means the heartberry in my language. And that heartberry is part of our ceremonies, but it's part of our teachings to help young people to understand their place. And we acknowledge that. We also acknowledge that western doorway. That's where our ancestors are. And our ancestors called to us. And that doorway is being looked after by our thunderbirds. And every once in a while they will come to us to remind us of who they are and what their job is and how they became a part of our life. We look to the north and acknowledge the spirit bear, Minonaakwhe, the white bear. And it's there in that direction that Everything that we experience in life is kept there. Everything that we experience in life, and that just doesn't include us, because we're only a part of everything. But that includes those other things that are living as well, the trees, the Nidosag, the little spirits, the insects. We call them Nidosag, the little spirits. The grasses. Everything that we experience here is recorded there, and that record is left there. And some of it is given to us when we come back into this world. And as it was explained to me, that's why we know certain things already. We're not going to touch that spider. We're not going to touch that snake, because we're given the answers to it already. It's innate. We were born with that. And that's where all that is kept. And when we leave here, we will also leave our story behind, along with everything else. We acknowledge that spirit that looks after the water. We're made up mostly of water. I needed that water. We can live a long time without food. Can't live very long without water. And it is an important thing to us. That's why we need to look after the water even here in this land. If we ever produce, or if we ever pollute the water that we're made here to look after, that's the end of us. So we have to be mindful of it. And we understand that, and that's why we stood for Site 41 and fought against that so many years ago. That's why we do it, because those are our instructions. It's not because we don't have jobs. It's not because we don't have anything else to do. It's because those are our original instructions, and we take that seriously, and we will be there. We will be there for all those things. And we acknowledge the earth and everything that she gave to us to live. And as I was walking in, I saw that there were clovers on the lawn over here. And clovers are things you could eat, so you could actually stay out here and live for a while if you needed to. Just live on those. And we forget that kind of thing as we go through our modern lives, and we forget that we could actually, if we needed to. You don't need McDonald's. Everything we need is already given to us. And we acknowledge our Creator, God, whoever you might understand that to be. And we acknowledge our Creator. I acknowledge with this medicine. And I say, Miigwech, thank you for all that we're given, and thank you for this experience here this evening. Thank you, Madeline. Miigwech, thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of the night and introduce Simcoe County for Palestine and Simcoe County KAIROS, and then we will get started. So we're going to go until about 9 p.m. Jeff will speak for about an hour, and we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. Washrooms are just in the entrance where you came in. They're just by there. If you need to use the washroom, feel free to step out at any time. Okay, so a few words about Simcoe County for Palestine. So following October 7th, the Barrie Mosque began holding demonstrations for Palestine in Barrie. Inspired to keep these organizing efforts going and to connect people regionally, we started this grassroots group, Simcoe County for Palestine, in November of 2023. We have been organizing consistently throughout these 8 months of genocide in Gaza. Our group has grown to hundreds of members, and we have organized or helped to organize over 50 events and demonstrations in Simcoe County. These have included rallies, marches, banner drops, film screenings, teach-ins, letter and phone campaigns to politicians, disrupting politicians in public, a fundraiser, and tabling at community events. We invite you to get involved with us. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Simcoe County for Palestine, join our WhatsApp channel, and join our e-newsletter list. Our sign-up clipboard is on the table out in the hallway. And I'm going to pass it over to Elaine from Simcoe County KAIROS to say a few words.
Hi, and welcome everyone. It's on already, okay. So welcome. I'd like to say a few words about KAIROS and also say thank you to a few people. KAIROS is a Greek word. There are two words in Greek for time. Chronological time, we're all familiar with, and KAIROS, which is a critical moment in time, a time for action. And KAIROS Canada acts at two different levels. At the national level, there are 10 different churches and church organizations that have joined their voices together to act ecumenically for social justice. And at the local level, there are groups like Simcoe County KAIROS across the country. There are many groups like ours. There are people here tonight from York Region KAIROS, for instance. And these groups work locally. They're moved by the mission of KAIROS Canada, and they work with people in their community from all walks of life, religious or not. KAIROS Canada has long been concerned about the plight of Palestinian people, and since October 7th has been a voice for peace. One of the latest actions has been the involvement with the Gaza ceasefire pilgrimage. There were 48 held across the country, and there was also a large one in Ottawa held on May 22nd, where the heads of many of the mainline churches in Canada got together to do the walk, to speak to power, and to hold a press conference. So if you would like to listen to that press conference, it's really worth it. You can go to kairoscanada.org and find the words of those people. It was quite well done. I'd like to thank a few people, but I would like you to hold your applause to the end. I first want to thank Jeff Halper for coming all the way up to Barrie to be with us, and his aide, Kathy Bergen, who has facilitated his trip in Canada. I would also like to thank the MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, who invited Jeff to come, and so without them, we wouldn't have him in Canada. And the MCC is a member of KAIROS at the national level. Next, I'd like to thank Grace United for letting us use their wonderful facility. Grace United is a member of Simcoe County KAIROS, and we're happy to have them be so generous with us. I'd like to thank Kathy Watt, our technician, our tech support, who is helping us tonight. And finally, I'd like to thank Simcoe County for Palestine for their energy and their hard work. Thank you.
So, with heavy hearts, we want to stress the importance and urgency of the numbers in Gaza right now. These are conservative estimates. The actual death toll and injury toll is likely much higher than these. We are at over 45,000 people killed, over 15,000 of which are children. Over 22,000 people have been injured. 108 journalists have been killed. More than 2 million people have been displaced. Every single university, hospital, and mosque has been bombed. There's a humanitarian crisis of famine. And since October 7th, more than 70,000 tons of bombs have been dropped on Gaza. That's twice what was dropped on Dresden, Hamburg, and London during World War II combined. So we want to stress that while relief and aid donations are crucial, the borders are currently closed and aid is not getting in. So advocacy and raising our voices is the single most important thing we can be doing right now. Without our voices calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire and for justice, for sanctions, for an arms embargo, we will continue to witness this devastating loss of life. We have seen the complete and utter failure of our politicians to do anything about this genocide, including Canada approving $28.5 million worth of military exports to Israel between October and December 2023. More in the first 3 months of this genocide than in any single year in the last 30 years, which is so shameful and crazy. So please consider this call to action for advocacy and to get involved, and come see me or any other organizer afterwards to learn more about getting involved with us and with advocacy. So now, very quickly, there are four other groups here that are very important that I want to give a quick plug to. So can we please have Krista, Nikolai, Lucas, and Sam come up, and they're gonna give a quick, like, 1 minute, less than 1 minute plug about their organization. We've been very fortunate to be working closely with other groups and building these connections and partnerships, and I'd like to share a little bit what you're doing. So we'll start with Krista.
Yes, so I am with Christians for Just Peace. Christians for Just Peace was formed in an effort to engage our local Christian community here in Barrie and the surrounding area to act for peace, for justice, and for reconciliation for every single human being in Israel and the occupied territories. Our second aim is to also create an environment where we can wrestle together within community, where we can ask hard theological questions, where we can seek God's heart for what He is asking of us as we witness these atrocities. And then lastly, Christians for Just Peace prioritizes amplifying the voices of Christian Palestinians. So if that interests you, we have a table in the back, and we'd love to get you signed up for our email updates. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Nikolai Melamed. I'm here with Jewish Alliance of Simcoe. And we are a local Jewish anti-Zionist collective. Many of us have been organizing in community for a long time, but we decided to unite together in the events following October the 7th, and in collaboration with Simcoe County for Palestine, in order to raise our voices together to assert that there is absolutely nothing anti-Semitic about protesting the state of Israel, and that we in fact believe that anti-Zionism is a fundamental pillar of Judaism. And so our goal is to not only uplift Palestinian voices and fight for Palestinian liberation, but also to create Jewish anti-Zionist spaces where we can practice our culture and we can share it with others in mutual exchange of intercultural experience. And we hope that we can continue doing that work. We hope we will fight for Palestinian liberation for as long as it's necessary, and we will do the work of creating Jewish cultural spaces where we can also share that culture with everyone, Jewish or not, for as long as we live. So that's us.
Thank you. My name is Lucas. I'm a member of both Simcoe County for Palestine and Food Not Bombs. And Food Not Bombs is an organization built around the idea that world governments around us, specifically here in Canada, we should be spending our resources and money, instead of sending aid and resources to genocide people world around, we can be spending that money to serve food and help those people here and abroad. We can be found on Facebook at Food Not Bombs Barrie, and emailed at fnbbarrie2024@gmail.com. Thank you.
Hi all, my name is Sam. I'm the Canadian organizer and co-founder of a group called Mennonite Action. Mennonite Action is a group of Mennonites, Anabaptists, peace-seeking Christian, and other allies bonded by the common belief we must be vocal and public about our peace values and do everything in our power, especially in times of violence and warfare. Right now, since October, we have been organizing different hymn sing protests, different rallies to try and target our institution and public officials to use their platforms, voices, and power to work for a ceasefire, two-ways arms embargo, and peace and justice in Palestine. Currently, right now, we have a few initiatives locally here in Canada. We are trying to put pressure on the University of Waterloo after the university has sued several of its encampment students for $1.5 million. This includes one of our organizers for Mennonite Action and also a few Mennonite students in the encampment. We are collecting signatures to send a letter to the senior admin of the university telling them to drop these charges, and then soon we will be delivering these letters, printing them off and hand delivering them to the admin to try and put further pressure on them. If you're interested about any of our actions across Canada and the United States, go to MennoniteAction.org or follow us on Instagram, Facebook, etc. at Mennonite Action. Thank you all.
So I'm going to welcome up Kathy now. Kathy has been organizing Jeff's tour, and she's going to speak about the tour and the organization she's a part of.
Can all of you hear me if I speak from here? Okay. Two things. Jeff has done many tours. I've organized at least 3 national tours for him. 2 in the United States when I was working with the Quakers in Philadelphia, and 1 here in Canada after I retired from Ramallah. So this time he said he was coming just to Ontario. So I'm organizing his tour in Ontario, and it's very different from in the past national tours, because when you do a national tour, you go to Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, etc., Victoria, St. John's. This time being just in Kitchener, Waterloo, we were able to make him available to places like Barrie, Hamilton. He is going to Toronto as well. He's going to 5 places now. I'm trying to think, where else are you going? London, England. We were there yesterday. And so it's just been a pleasure working with people here locally in Ontario. I just want to mention Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights, which I'm part of, is organizing this tour. We brought him here, and or he came here, and we had to deal with him. But there are other co-sponsors, and another group I'm part of is the Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, which is part of Mennonite Church Canada. PIN, Palestine Israel Network. I'm part of that group. They're a co-sponsor. Mennonite Action is a co-sponsor. Let's see, we have Jewish Voice for Independent Jewish Voices. We have actually 9 of them. I won't list them all because I can't remember them all right now. But we have 9 co-sponsors, so we're very happy for that. And we're so pleased to be here in Barrie. And hope that all of you will be interested in buying Jeff's book. It's his latest book called Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine. I'm going to take the books outside. I'll be at the table. They're $25 Canadian. And Jeff will be, as soon as the program's over, Jeff will be there to sign books if any of you want his signature. Thank you.
All right, thanks. My name's Mac, and I'm going to read Jeff's bio. Jeff Halper is an Israeli anthropologist, director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and a founding member of the One Democratic State campaign. He served as the president of Friends World College, an international college program, and has taught at universities in Israel, the US, Latin America, and Africa. Jeff has often spoken at the UN International Meeting on the Question of Palestine. In 2008, he sailed into Gaza with the Free Gaza Movement to break the Israeli siege and was jailed in Gaza by Israel after the boat reached Gaza. Jeff was nominated by the American Friends Service Committee for the Nobel Peace Prize, together with the Palestinian intellectual and activist Ghassan Andani. Jeff's latest books are War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification. They're shortlisted for the Palestine Book Award, and Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. So thank you very much for coming, Jeff. The stage is yours.
Thank you all for inviting me, and really the range of organizations and groups is very impressive. You know, I'm privileged to be here, and especially to try to address an issue that we all know is of global importance, not merely local importance, which is the liberation of Palestine. I want to start just with two acknowledgements of my own. One is, you know, that we have to acknowledge, well, it's been said, the genocide that's going on in Gaza at this moment. I say that because we'll be talking tonight about politics and a little bit theory, and you know, with the understanding that as terrible as things are, the only way out in the end is a political resolution. There has to be a political plan, a political program, and that's really important. But sometimes, you know, and people have told me that you know, it's inappropriate to talk about politics and models and so on in the middle of a genocide. You know, let's wait till the genocide is over, or let's wait till the ceasefire, and then when there's more calm, that's the time. That's not the case. We have to, at the same time, we have to multitask. We have to keep our eyes focused appropriately on what's happening in Gaza. Our hearts are with the people of Gaza, of course, and not only Gaza, by the way. We have to also remember the West Bank is under in some ways similar pressures. You know, Israel is attacking the Tulkarm and Jenin refugee camps today with exactly the same conventional military weaponry that it's using in Gaza. Tanks, artillery, drones, special forces, and so on. Not to mention the ethnic cleansing that's going on all through the West Bank, clearing the land for the final legitimization of Israeli apartheid. We'll talk about that, but that brings us to the bigger picture, and that is that if you look at the bigger geopolitical picture, Gaza is marginal. Gaza is a nuisance. The Palestinians in general are a nuisance. What Biden and Canada, the G7, the NATO countries, the global north, really want to get back to is normalization. And remember that term, because we're going to come back to it in the context of settler colonialism. Normalization, that's what Biden said from the first hour that the Gaza assault began. And that is a normalization process between Israel. Now we have to remember Israel between the river and the sea. And because that's where the settlements are. Israel is not confined anymore to the 1967 borders. There's 750,000 settlers that live in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, all the way to the Jordan Valley, which has been completely ethnically cleansed already. And normalization of that entity with Saudi Arabia in particular. Of course, Jordan is already normalized. The Gulf states, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. So that what that would do, and don't forget, you know, a week or so before October 7th, Netanyahu appeared in the UN holding a map of what we call the Greater Israel, Israel over all of historic Palestine, holding up the map and saying we are on the cusp of a new Middle East, of really a new world order in some ways, because next week we're going to sign the normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. And I think that was partly the timing behind the attack of October 7th. Because if normalization goes through, and had it gone through at that time, the Palestinians would have been erased, eliminated as any kind of a political force. But that remains the geopolitical agenda. In other words, Gaza, as much of a genocide, and genocide is like the ultimate crime, is nevertheless, in the larger picture, the global political picture, a hiccup. It's disrupted this process of normalization that's intended to normalize, to end the so-called Palestinian issue, to legitimize Israeli apartheid, and then to get on with things. And the bigger things, of course, are like the United States is desperate to get out of the Middle East and to pivot to China. That's its real global agenda. And therefore, it has to create a kind of a Middle Eastern surrogate, which would be a Middle Eastern NATO based on Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, in which Israel is the only military power capable of dealing with Iran and of representing Western interests in the Middle East. So we live in a world, we've heard a lot of talk already tonight about values and justice and human rights, Christian values, Jewish values, indigenous spiritual values, and so on. But we live in an international community in which that's ridiculous. Human rights, international law, spiritualism, religion, justice, freedom, liberation are laughable. We live in an international community, by international community I mean of governments, the international political system, that's absolutely transactional. It's transactional. It's all deals, it's all interests, it's all jockeying for power and position and so on. And in that kind of a world, Israel has a lot to offer. Israel will be your NATO pillar in the Middle East against Iran, protecting Western oil interests, geopolitical interests, and in particular, a counter to Chinese incursions into the Middle East as well, freeing the United States then to shift to China. So that's what matters. That's how Israel gets away with it. That's why Israel support, and in a transactional world, what in the hell do Palestinians have to offer? What do they have? They have oil? Do they have resources? Do they have any geopolitical clout? Do they have a high-tech military industry that they can somehow, could they, supplant Israel as the basis of NATO? They have nothing of value in a transactional world based entirely on power and interest and money and those sorts of things. And that's why it's so important that we the people, because we're the only allies, this is the disconnect between us and our governments. In that our governments absolutely do not function according to the values that we hold dear, and therefore it's incumbent on us, and that's why I really am genuinely impressed, by the organization and the support that went into this event, because that's the only thing that's going to save the Palestinians. It's not going to be peace processes and some kind of political plan in which governments decide things. It's going to be the pressures of people that care about justice and human rights and international law and people's lives that's really going to matter. And that's why I'm here in front of you and not in Parliament. Because the Parliament might be, or the government might be where the power lies, but this is where the justice lies, and we somehow have to find ways, and we have done it before, in terms of the anti-apartheid struggles and other struggles, to really make our values mean something in the political world. So that's why we're focusing on the political tonight in the midst of a genocide, because we have to do both. We have to focus on both. The second thing I want to acknowledge, and this is kind of a Jeff meeting a Jeff. This is Jeff the Settler, who's coming after Jeff the indigenous. And I have to acknowledge, of course, that I'm a settler. I grew up in the United States. Actually, not so far from here. I grew up in northern Minnesota. So I kind of sound like him, even. But I moved to Israel, which is a very neutral way of saying it, more than 50 years ago. I live in Jerusalem. I'm not going to get into all of that stuff, why, and it wasn't exactly Zionism, but nevertheless, I didn't immigrate to Israel. I settled in Israel. I am a settler, and what I call myself, you'll see in the book I open the book, I'm a settler who refuses, or a colonizer who refuses. In other words, it's very important that I accept that I'm a settler, and then from that perspective, I'm able then to reach out, gain credibility, work with the indigenous Palestinian population, and become a comrade in terms of a common struggle for liberation and justice. And so I think, even though I understand what Jeff is saying about, it's not enough, obviously, the acknowledgements are important. And the fact that you acknowledge, and you brought Jeff to acknowledge, the settler colonial character and history of Canada, is really important. We're not even near that in Israel. If I got up in Tel Aviv and said, I'm a settler who refuses, no one would understand what now I'm talking about. So you're much further ahead from that point of view. And so I just wanted to say that as we start, okay? Having cleared the decks now of everything, let's get on. All right, let's begin in this way. We have to do a fundamental paradigm shift. It's hard to know what screen to focus on. I'm going to look this way, I think, but you guys look any way you want. Get out of the way. Ah. 20 years ago, that would have been great. I think I'll focus over here. Why do you think Biden always stands like this? He's focusing on whatever's closest. We have to begin by a paradigm shift. The terms we use, the analytical frameworks we use are really important. When you go to a doctor, you have a pain in your chest. The doctor has 1 million pills on the shelf. He or she can take any pill and give it to you. But that can be dangerous. The treatment depends on the diagnosis. Are you having an anti-acid attack and the doctor can give you a Tums, or are you having a stroke? And the treatment flows from the diagnosis. And the problem has been all these years, we and the governments in particular, that are trying to do all kinds of peace processes and negotiations and so on, are misanalyzing what the disease really is, what the problem is. And that is that it is not a conflict. We always use the word conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what's a conflict? A conflict is when two sides come to dispute about something, get into a fight about something. Well, the minute you say sides, you've already legitimized Israeli settler colonialism. You've legitimized colonialism. In other words, by itself, we would all agree that colonialism is illegitimate. I mean, there is no possible justification for any kind of colonialism, settler or non-settler. It's unjust, it's cruel, it's genocidal, as we'll talk about in a minute. There's no way to justify it. But the minute you put it in the context of a conflict, it's already a side. And once it's a side, now it has that status. Now you can criticize us, but you can't delegitimize us because we're a side. in a conflict. So that's the first danger. What it also does is it creates a false symmetry. Now there's two sides, right? And we hear the language all the time. Both sides should end the conflict. Both sides should negotiate. Both sides should end the violence, right? We hear that all the time. So that creates a symmetry, you know, as if the colonizers and the colonized are somehow at the same level. And the third problem is, how do you get out of this? What do the sides have to do to resolve the conflict? Well, you have to sit down. You have to gain trust with each other. You know, have a meal together, you know, and then negotiate and compromise. Well, what are the colonized, what are the indigenous supposed to compromise on? What are we forcing them in this conflict resolution mode to negotiate? That 78% of their country belongs to Zionist settlers, you know, and if Palestinians say, well, we're not settling with 22% of our country, we would like to have 23%, you're being unreasonable. You're being intractable. You know, you have to negotiate in good faith. 2 states, of course, the just 2-state solution is 78% for the Jews and 22% for the Arabs, the indigenous population. So we're already, by the very nature of trying to resolve a conflict, forcing Palestinians to compromise, even to discuss things that they shouldn't have to discuss. Their right to their country shouldn't be negotiable. What else do they have to negotiate? They have to negotiate how many refugees can come back. You know, there's 7 million refugees. Half the Palestinian population are refugees, driven out of the country, and of course with their descendants over the last, 8 decades. What are they supposed to compromise? Israel won't allow 7 million refugees to come back. It's their right to come back. They have a right to return in international law. But that right doesn't mean anything because in conflict you've got to compromise. So now I have to compromise my own rights. And do you know that's illegal? In international law, which is very interesting, you are not allowed to abrogate your own rights. So even if you're in a situation of negotiations and you're the Palestinians and you're the weak party, you can be forced by Israel, with the United States putting pressure as well, you can be forced to sign a peace agreement, a 2-state agreement, compromising and all these sorts of things. It's not hard to force the weak party to agree. But the weak party, whichever Palestinian leader signs on any agreement that gives up the right to Palestine, the right of refugees to return, their right to their heritage, is acting illegally. That treaty is not legitimate because you're not allowed to sign away your rights. So that conflict is an impossible and unjust and unworkable framework for what isn't a conflict anyway, because there aren't 2 sides. So what are we really talking about? We're talking about not a conflict, and we have to get rid of that term. We're talking about an anti-colonial struggle. An anti-colonial struggle, and struggle is ongoing. Conflict, is kind of a self-contained sort of a thing. It's an anti-colonial struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. That's really what we should be talking about, and that means we have to begin to adopt, and we'll see this on the way, anti-colonial language. Because as long as we use conflict language, we're locking ourselves and the Palestinians into that trap, right? For example, I'll just start with a real little example. I wouldn't use the word refugees, because refugees implies that these are people that were driven out. They are refugees. No. In anti-colonial language, they're dispossessed. Dispossession is what they are. Dispossession is how they got to the camps It isn't because somehow they're refugees, right? So that we have to begin to adopt that kind of a language, and that leads us then into a political process, because you end the conflict through compromise, right? The only way you end colonialism, and settler colonialism in particular, is through decolonization. Through decolonization. You have to dismantle the structures of domination and control that the settler enterprise has laid over the country and the whole population in order to clear the space for a new political and social order. I'll get used to this in a second. For a new political and social order. So and I think that's what Jeff was sort of referring to when he said acknowledgement is fine, but where's the decolonization? You know, we've got the acknowledgement, but we don't have the decolonization. You know, Desmond Tutu used to say, you know, as a Christian, he says, if you steal my pencil, I forgive you. But I want my pencil back. You know, so I think what Jeff is telling us is thank you for the acknowledgments, and that's important, but I'd like my pencil back, which is decolonization, which we're kind of far from in any settler colonial enterprise. So that's the paradigm shift I think we have to begin with. And so what I want to do is take a few minutes. I know it's getting late. I'm going to try to do this as fast as I can. Take a few minutes and unpack what do we mean by settler colonialism? What is the disease that we're talking about? It's interesting because, you know, most of these concepts remain kind of in the academic world, in the rarefied world of academia. They don't, you know, we don't really use academic terms very much. Settler colonialism, which is kind of a mouthful, right, somehow broke through. It escaped the university and it's gotten into public discourse. So all the time, people are talking about settler colonialism. That's how you start now almost every discussion of what's happening in Palestine. The problem is, of course, that it's not understood. It's a tremendously important and meaningful term, but all its power is gone because people have sort of taken it as kind of a mantra or an accusation. In Israel's Zionism is a settler colonialism. All right, we've said that, it's out of the way now, let's go on to other things. But it means something, it's something we have to dwell on, and it's the basis of any kind of political program that we can formulate. So let's just take a couple minutes and look a little bit at what that means, because then we'll be able to move on to what I really want to talk about, which is one democratic state as the decolonization political process leading to a just resolution. So first of all, a settler movement, and you know this, and this is going to sound very familiar to you, because even though, of course, there are very different types of settler colonial enterprises, every settler colonial movement, and if I had more time and you were more interested, I have all kinds of models to show this. The settler colonial projects have very similar stages and logics and processes and mechanisms, and so do the resistance, the development of resistance of the indigenous populations. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to sound familiar with you, even though I don't really know enough about Canada to into it. So, okay. So first of all, the settler colonial movement invents a narrative and entitles it to replace the native population and take its land. In other words, settlers aren't bad people. You know, so how can I be, you know, you see Ma and Pa in the covered wagon with their little girls, you know, going, you know, they're not evil people. So how can they justify killing the Indians or killing the indigenous? Or in Africa, if you read any of the books of Elspeth Huxley, you know, You get into that in Kenya, taking the land and exploiting, the native population, or in Palestine. How do you justify that to yourself? I mean, how can you look in the mirror in the morning and say, yesterday I took some farmer's land and threw them all? You've got to have some kind of a protective bubble, a protection around you that allows you to do these things and feel that they're justified and they're good and they're important, and usually God's involved. Somehow, you're doing what God wanted as well. And so you have, for example, in the United States, I don't know about Canada, the United States, you have the idea of manifest destiny, which was divinely inspired, and it was divinely ordained that the continent would belong to the white person, the right race. I mean, there are all kinds of terms. The Catholic Church had its doctrine of discovery, in which it took a lot of Latin America and other places, saying that, the natives are subhuman because they don't have concepts like law and land ownership and religion and things like that, God and all of that. South Africa had the Dutch Reformed Church, the idea that South Africa belongs to the white man. The French, that didn't like religion very much, had the idea of a civilizing mission, right, to the indigenous. Zionism had a ready-made narrative. You got the Bible, not the Bible, the way you're thinking of it, very selective. The first 5 books of the Bible and the book of Joshua. If you ever want to read a definition of genocide, the clearest definition, read the book of Joshua. God is an absolutely genocidal God, and he commands Joshua and the Israelites, and not only in Joshua, but earlier on in the Bible as well, not only to take the land, not only that it belongs to them exclusively, but to kill every single man, woman, child, ass, donkey, cow, dog, everything that lives in the Canaanite world, right, in order to take possession of that country. So not only is the narrative in place right away for the Zionist movement, you could really say that what happened at the turn of the 20th century until today, the Zionist settler colonial takeover of Palestine, is the second round. It's almost a repeat, both in terms of concepts and justifications and processes of what happened 2,500 years ago, or actually 3,500 years ago, in Canaan. I mean, it's exactly the same process of settler colonialism that Joshua did. Joshua and the Israelites engaged in the settlement of Canaan in exactly the same way. And I'll mention that genocide is built into settler colonialism. So you invent that kind of a narrative, and now you can do anything you want to clear the land because God wants you to, or civilization wants you to, and you're protected. You don't have to feel guilty about it at all. Now the settlers invade the country. It's not always like Normandy, you actually invade. Invasion can be even unperceived sometimes. It took the Palestinians, if the Zionist invasion began in 1882, it took the Palestinians maybe almost 20 years before they began to understand that this settler invasion to take over their country is underway. Because again, it's Ma and Pa and Jamestown and Pilgrims, and they're all, Thanksgiving, and they're peaceful, and they're Christian, and they're few in number, and they're cutting down a couple trees to build, it doesn't look threatening. And the indigenous population doesn't understand what happened. I mean, when Jeff was talking about the extinction of indigenous tribes, look what happened in Plymouth Colony. Look what happened with the Thanksgiving, if you know the story. The first year they're there, they're starving. you know, and the indigenous tribes came, and not only gave them food, but showed them how to grow food and how to hunt. You know, the second or third Thanksgiving, when they were a little bit more established, the Pilgrims exterminated that same tribe that had helped them. So that, you know, it is an invasion. It has to be genocidal. So how do you take over someone else's country and replace them with yourself without being genocidal? It can't be. So there's an invasion of the country in order to make it your own. In other words, to transform Palestine into Israel, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, to transform Turtle Island into Canada. And so I'm staying with, yesterday I was in London, you know, with the Thames River going through it. I mean, you know, talk about, you know, replacing. I mean, it's in your face here, kind of. Settler colonialism is unilateral. That's why it's not a conflict. The Palestinians never got into a fight with Jews. They never got into a dispute. There was no conflict. You know, Jews had lived in Palestine for a millennia. When Jews came to the country, they would come not as settlers. They came as either immigrants or they came as pilgrims or religious communities. The point is they came to fulfill their religious lives, or they wanted to be in the land of Israel. It was culturally meaningful for them, but they integrated with the local population. They didn't threaten it, they'd integrate it. Zionism came like settlers do with the idea of taking the country over, and it was unilateral. And therefore, a term we don't often use, we almost never use, is the term Judaization. We're Judaizing Palestine. You know, we use terms like occupation, apartheid, conflict, because those are terms that we understand, and they're terms that have legal references. You know, there's laws against apartheid. There's laws against, genocide, obviously, and occupation, the 14th Geneva Convention. Judaization even sounds vaguely anti-Semitic to use that term, so we don't tend to use it. But it's exactly the right term, because that's exactly what the Zionist settlers wanted to do, to Judaize the country. What does it mean to take it over and remake it? Remake it as a Jewish country. Look at the flag of Israel. You know, look at what Netanyahu says. You know, this is the Jewish, he represents the Jewish. It's not Israeli. It isn't that, you know, somehow a country, no, it's Jewish. And Jewish in Israel trumps Israeli. So there is no real Israeli. Why? Because Israeli includes Arabs. You know, 20% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish, actually more. So that Judaism is the term. We're Judaizing Palestine, and that gets at the idea of settler colonialism, and much better than the other terms that we use more often. So this kind of puts the finger on what we're talking about. Like we said, it's an inherently violent process. It's a process in which genocide is inherent in settler colonialism. Whether it's physical genocide, that I think was more typical of Canada, probably, but certainly cultural genocide. In Palestine, even though you have genocides like going on today, and other times as well, the form of genocide has been more cultural. The erasure of Palestinians, driving them out, confining them to marginal enclaves, and until today, eliminating the physical, cultural, and historic presence that they have in the country. So it's inherently violent, it's inherently genocidal, and therefore we cannot equate, and that's why the conflict model is terrible as well. Again, we cannot equate violence. We talk about violence. What is violence? You know, you can't equate in terms of violence, let's say, in those kinds of languages that don't distinguish between power differentials and intents and so on, you can't equate indigenous resistance with the violent campaigns of the settlers. You can't confuse the colonial violence with the violence or the resistance of the indigenous population. So resistance is another colonial term. You know, you see, what Israel and Canada prefer to say is terrorism. They want to criminalize resistance because, again, if the settlers are entitled to the land, and if they're normalizing their presence in the country and remaking the country, you know, if you go downtown, go try to buy a ticket to Palestine, a plane ticket. I mean, the travel agent won't know what you're talking. You mean Pakistan, right? You know, there is no plane ticket to Palestine. There's no airport in Palestine. There's no airline. You know, oh, you mean Israel. So in other words, even if you're going to Bethlehem, to the church in the West Bank, which isn't Israel, you buy a ticket to Israel, right? And you land at Ben Gurion Airport and you go to Bethlehem. So that if the indigenous are attacking a normal, peaceful, everyday society, then they must be criminals. You know, Israelis are always saying, why are the Arabs, we don't use the word Palestinians, why are the Arabs attacking us? Why did they attack all those people on October 7th? Innocent people, which is true. Innocent people at a music festival or in their homes or whatever. You know, and of course, in the Israeli discourse, everything begins with October 7th. So that when Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, said, whoa, October 7th happened in a context, the Israelis were furious. Because the minute you admit there's a context, the minute you admit this, Israelis aren't normal, that it's not exactly citizens, that are just living in a normal kind of a situation, that there is, beneath that, like a poltergeist, there's beneath those music festivals genocide that's happened. I mean, it's happened on top of Palestinian communities that were buried underneath, the Israeli kibbutzim and towns that were there, that were attacked. There's the replacement. 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees. I mean, how many times does that come out in the news? You see? So that resistance doesn't make any sense if you look at this as a normal Israel, normal people. October 7th was this terrible thing done by criminals, insane criminals. That's what we call Sinwar and the others, against innocent people. Well, there is a context. And if we begin to use words like settler colonialism, like Judaization, and so on, then resistance, which is a colonial term, makes more sense. Because if you remove what's being resisted, then it becomes a criminal form of terrorism, and all settler colonial states criminalize resistance. So we have to insist on that as the proper political term. I won't get into all of this. And so there's insecurity built into the settler state, and the insecurity isn't only a matter of military insecurity. Now, in Canada, the indigenous population, the First Nations, don't constitute any kind of security threat or military threat to the Canadian government or society or state or whatever. And yet, Jeff says, the genocides continue. Well, why? If there's no resistance in a sense, and if there's no insecurity, and there's no threat, then why is it continue? Because it's not necessarily the threat. I mean, you see it more in Palestine, where the Palestinians do mount a real military threat to Israel. But more than that, it's the presence of the indigenous. That's the threat. That's the insecurity. Because you can't normalize. That's how settler colonialism ends. Settler colonialism ends, or I'll come back. Settler colonialism ends by normalization. That's how it ends, where all the crimes, the indigenous presence, everything that happened is erased. That's why Israel says it all began on October 7th, you see? So that it's the very presence of the indigenous that doesn't allow you to normalize. It doesn't allow you to put the lid on and say it's over, now everything is okay, now you can't do, there's never a closure. And not only that, but the very presence of the indigenous. And even if they're trees, or the remains of their houses, or whatever, has to remind you of the crimes you committed. Somehow you can try to forget it, you can have your narratives, you can block it out, but it's there. And you go up, in Israel, if you go into the woods, because almost all the Palestinian villages and towns that were destroyed, that weren't rebuilt upon, are today under forests or in parks. So if you wander into a Jewish National Fund park, right, all forested, and you begin to see ruins around, you know what the sign says? These are Byzantine ruins. Nothing about this was a Palestinian village, it was demolished in 1940. No, this was reminds of a Byzantine convent or a crusader sometime. In other words, that's a part of the erasure because and they know it's not true. So the very fact that you had to lie and make that sign, why did you have to make that sign? Why couldn't you even not have a sign? Because if you didn't have a sign, people might suspect what it really is. That's the insecurity. And that's what you see going on today in Gaza. I'm not going to go into this, but the bulldozer, from my point of view, I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. There's been, since 1948, since the Nakba until today, Israel's demolished about 200,000 Palestinian homes throughout Palestine, including more than 530 entire villages, towns, urban areas, and of course taken the land. Only in the last 9 months, since October 7th, Israel's demolished 300,000 homes in Gaza. And it has no military justification. There's no military justification for the demolishing of homes. And we all know what homes are. We have a primordial language, mother, father, home. Home is a part of that. A human being cannot function without a home. When you have homeless people, it's not just that they're homeless. They can't function as normal human beings because they don't have that security. They don't have that family space, the intimate space that home is. So the demolition of homes is not only ethnic cleansing, it's the erasure of a people, including all the humiliation, and trauma that's involved. These are D9 bulldozers. Now they're automated. You know what? They automated D9 bull, and look how big they are. Here are some people by the shovel. I mean, look how huge these monstrous machines are, especially designed to destroy buildings. The shovel is engineered because in a normal Caterpillar bulldozer that you see by the highway or that's used in mining, these are really mining machines that have been converted to military uses. If the bulldozer hits the building will collapse on the driver. So Israeli military engineers, together with Caterpillar engineers, and this is all sold to Israel as American military aid. right, have sat down and designed a shovel that when it hits a building, the building collapses away from the driver. You see, and it can be a 5-story building or whatever. So that this is, and these precede the tanks. If you see pictures of the Israeli army going into Gaza, it's the bulldozers first. As a matter of fact, their motto is always first. That's the motto of the Israeli combat engineering unit, always first. Because they're the ones that create the pathways. When the Israeli army destroyed the hospital in Khan Yunis, it was surrounded by thousands of people in tents, encampments as we're calling them here. You know, refugees that had sought refuge, especially by hospitals, sometimes inside the hospitals. These bulldozers, to get to the hospitals, simply ran over them. Thousands of people were killed by these bulldozers. And and to clear the way, and the 300,000 homes that were demolished by these. And these bulldozers, you know, part of it is also to minimize. That's part of the game as well. So what are these bulldozers called? Officially, they're called the Panda. That's the name, the Caterpillar, the D9 Panda bulldozers, but affectionately, they're called teddy bear by the Israeli army. So these are teddy bear bulldozers that have demolished 300,000 homes and killed thousands of people. And in terms of the erasure, this was the Islamic University before, and this is the Islamic University in Gaza after, today. It was destroyed, and the commander that destroyed it intentionally, and all the universities have been destroyed, all the libraries, almost all the mosques, community centers, not to mention, we have lists on our website, the writers, the poets, the artists that have been killed as well, and the journalists that were mentioned. No military necessity, no military, the general that demolished it said, we demolished this because it's a cultural symbol of the Palestinians. We know how important it is for them, and you know, if we can destroy that, we humiliate them, and we, you know, the Rabbi Maimonides, who's one of the most famous Jewish rabbis, said that humiliation is worse than murder. Because in murder, you kill the body. Humiliation, you kill the spirit, the essence of the person. And this is a form of humiliation, murderous humiliation for the purpose of erasure. And it's really the symbol of settler colonialism because it has nothing to do with military. It's not that kind of insecurity. It's the insecurity of the fact that as long as the presence of the indigenous is there, you haven't normalized. You can't get on with things because it's like the poltergeist again. You know, the crimes are always there. Okay. And this is just a map that you all know of the process of Judaization and the flip side of Judaization, of course, which is de-Arabization. And finally, like I said, the settler colonial project triumphs when it becomes normalized. All right. So that's the diagnosis. That's the disease. All right. Now, what's the treatment? How do you get out of it? Well, you don't get out of it through conflict resolution. What are you going to have, the genocidal settlers who know exactly what they're doing, who want the country, who want to dispossess it, sit down and negotiate? and the people undergoing genocide are going to sit down and compromise on their rights, on their very existence. I mean, you know, once you understand the diagnosis, it's ridiculous what our governments are trying to suggest to us. I mean, it becomes clear why the two-state solution isn't only ridiculous politically, but it's unjust, it's humiliating, it's outrageous, you know, because of what it's asking the Palestinians to do and what it's asking us, you know, as if they're, and they know the two-state solution is gone. It never was. They know it never was, but it's a very convenient conflict management tool. So conflict works even in terms of management in a very effective way. So how do you get out of it? First step is decolonization. You have to decolonize all the structures of control and domination that the settler colonial enterprise has imposed on the country. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but you can see these are some of the elements. The political, the land, of course, the land is key. And I think that's a little bit what Jeff is trying to get at, you know? You can acknowledge, okay, but you can't possibly get to a just solution, certainly in terms of land, as long as it's within a colonial context. Because then you're stuck with Desmond Tutu's thing. You're asking forgiveness, but you're keeping the pencil. In other words, as long as there's a settler colonial framework, the injustice is built in. You can't reform it. You can't make it more liberal. You can't make it more just or whatever. And so decolonization is as important in Canada as it is in Palestine. But certainly, since we're focused on Palestine tonight, that has to happen. I'm not going to obviously get into detail about that. Then, although it's an ongoing process, decolonization, then you begin to create a new reality on the ground, a new political and social order that is genuinely just. But it can only be done if all the colonial structures are dismantled. It can't be done in any kind of way in which any kind of settler control it remains intact. So I'm a part of what's called the One Democratic State Campaign, which is a Palestinian-led organization, but it has some anti-Zionist, critical Israelis like me involved. And what we're suggesting is fairly straightforward in terms of a political resolution after decolonization. And that is one democratic state. And it has these elements, and there's one hiccup that I'll dwell on for a minute. But basically, the way we see out of this is one state, one democratic state, and not, still haven't learned this thing. Old dogs have trouble with new tricks, even though there's 3 buttons. One state. No tricks. Because what you have now in Israel is you've got, especially in the left, the Zionist left, you've got all, you know, people know the two-state solution's gone. Okay, so how can we preserve the colonial structures and the Jewish supremacy and our control of the country and Zionism and all of that without a two-state solution? So there's all kinds of ideas of federations and confederations. And there's one group of real leftist people, my friends, that's called A Land for All. And that is, you know, well, there'll be one country, but we'll have 2 citizenships. And there'll be 2 separate parliaments, you know. Or there's ideas of cantons. Let's divide the country into 34 cantons. I mean, the country's the size of probably half of Barrie. Let's divide it into 34 cantons, based basically on where people are today. So where people are today, Israelis and Palestinians, is a colonial geography. I mean, after we've taken the land, after we've taken the most fertile land, after we've had the coastline, and we've got all the water and all the resources, now let's do cantons. So where Arabs are, in other words, where we've driven, those that haven't been driven out, where we've driven them into the marginal areas, right, we'll put up Palestinian cantons. And where Jews live, which is exclusive to Jews, because that's what Zionism is, those will be Jewish cantons. And then within that framework, we'll have one state. You know, well, the first question I ask is, well, what happened? The first thing that's going to happen the first day is all the Palestinian cantons are going to empty out. And they're all going to go to Tel Aviv. Because that's where the economy is, and that's where jobs are, that's where the beach is. You know, well, no, you can't do that because, you know, so now you're getting into processes in which, well, the cantons will have a certain say in terms of how many people can move in, and, you know, in other words, these are all kinds of convoluted ways of preserving Zionism and Jewish supremacy and control. The one state idea that we're proposing is simply says, not one genuine state, no tricks, right? In other words, one country, one citizenship, one parliament, one set of laws. Everyone lives wherever they want to, goes to school wherever they want to, with whoever they want to, marries whoever they want to, and so on. So that's the first thing. One constitutional democracy, which shouldn't be such an outrageous idea. I mean, I don't know if your newspaper is going to attack me tonight for suggesting this radical anti-Semitic idea of a democracy. Okay. Of course, the refugees return. But again, they have a double right to return. Not only do they have the right to return, all refugees have a right to return to their homes. But now we've introduced something new that has never existed, you know, in Palestine. Because you had the British first, and then you had the Ottomans, and then the British, and then the Israelis, the idea of citizenship, right? In other words, the country doesn't belong to the Sultan. It doesn't belong to the mandate power. It doesn't belong to the Jews. It belongs to all its citizens. That's what a democracy is, right, Jacob? Where is this? Jacob has to be sure I'm correct on this. It belongs to its citizens. That's really so that means then that refugees don't only have a right to return, international law, they're our citizens. Just because you were driven out of the country in the Nakba, or you fled, I mean, you know, people flee war zones, doesn't mean you lost your civil status. You know, if somebody flees Kyiv and goes to Poland, they don't stop being Ukrainian. And so there's a double, in a way, right to return, both as a refugee, or what I would say, again, as a dispossessed person, but also as a citizen coming back to your country as an equal citizen. Then you have, of course, individual rights. I won't get into that, the same as Canada, basically. Here's the hiccup, and I'm just going to dwell on it for a second because I know it's getting late and we want to have a good discussion. The idea of collective rights. And here is where there's a division among Palestinians in terms of what kind of democratic state. The one democratic state movement includes a lot of Palestinians. I mean, I don't know any Palestinians who are for two states or any of these other kinds of things. And the one state idea has always been the Palestinian agenda. You know, the PLO was founded on the basis of one secular state. We don't use the word secular, we talk about a non-sectarian state. But there's a big difference. Most Palestinians, and I'll just lay it out really quickly, because it's important, you know, and we can talk about it later if you want to. Most Palestinians would say liberation means liberation. You know, it's a Palestinian Liberation Organization. We're involved in a liberation struggle. Liberation means liberation. In other words, Palestine becomes Palestine again. You know, it's Palestine. It's called Palestine. Our national rights as Palestinians are restored, right? Our right to self-determination is restored. And we reclaim the country of Palestine that was taken from us. straightforward. Well, if you ask them, what about Israeli Jews? The answer is, in a way, who cares? Why should we care what happens to Israeli Jews? You know, they after what they did to us and so on. So the answer really is, okay, Israeli Jews can remain, of course, as equal citizens. Or they can leave. And I think the hope is that they'll leave. But they can remain as equal citizens, Israeli Jews, but they're living in a Palestinian state. In other words, the state, and this is the problem with this concept, because it's an ethno-state, it's a national state just like Israel is. In some ways, it's what we call a colonial reversal. So instead of Palestinians living in the Jewish democracy, now you start to have Jews living in a Palestinian democracy. Even though you can't compare the liberation of Palestine with the colonization that brought the Jews there, nonetheless, in terms of the political structure, it still becomes a kind of of an unjust or a structure in which a country belongs to one particular group, and that's very foreign to the Arab world, because you never had ethno-nationalism. You never had the concept of a nation state in the Arab world. It was always cultural nationalism. The aspiration was always that we're all Arabs. You know, we want unity. We want, you know, as much as, you know, Pan-Arabism was of course, the ideology of Nasser and so on. So that concept is really an importation of European ethno-nationalism into the Middle East. And we don't think it's going to work, even though that's the concept of liberation that I would say, just to throw out a number, 90% of the Palestinians today would accept. Our view, which is a minority view, but we're starting a process of dialogue and thinking this through with our Palestinian comrades, is a state, a civil state that belongs to all its citizens, right? And that would be then a state. We'd have to invent a new state, basically. We don't have a name for it. It could be called Palestine, although that's not really inclusive of everyone. Palestine, Israel. Let's just say, I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. Let's just say it's called Zatar. All right, you know what Zatar? You know, Zatar is the Palestinian herb, and I think everybody here knows what Zatar. But let's call it, and we're all Zatarians. We're all equal citizens of the state of Zatar. All right? Well, that means then that Zatar is the state, the civil state. This is our conception of one democratic state that belongs to everyone that lives there, including, of course, the refugees that come back. So you create that, but it's a very fragile thing because it's new. And this was tried in Africa in particular. In the post-colonial world, this was tried and almost always failed. Not always. Kenya has sort of managed to keep this. Some states are kind of coming back to it a little bit, but the problem is the civil state, Zatar, is very weak. The institutions aren't very strong. It's certainly not as strong as the national identities that are inside. And the problem with nationalism, and this is my issue with the Palestinians that support the idea of a Palestinian state. We all know how destructive nationalism is. You know, nationalism is not a tolerant, multicultural kind of a thing. Nationalism says we rule. It has an urge to hegemony. It has an urge to flatten all other differences, and it becomes very repressive, nationalism. So the problem is here, it's not a problem. The situation is that there are two national groups in the country. And here again is a big argument, because Palestinians do not recognize Israeli Jews as a national group. And they're right, in a sense, because you know, they're saying there's a logic to it. If we recognize Israeli Jews as a national group, we're recognizing and rewarding settler colonialism. I mean, they came here as colonists. Now all of a sudden, we've normalized, legitimized the idea that they're a nation that somehow, you know, belong in this country. That's true. But there's a whole other dimension, and that is legacies of colonialism. The problem is that even if you decolonize and dismantle all the structures of and so on, colonialism has left indelible legacies. The country is a completely different country. It's a different demography. There's cities where there never were. The economy is completely different. The agricultural yield for profit or whatever is very different from what it was in the subsistence pre-colonial time. There's new groups. I mean, the whole country is changed. And that has to be taken into account. And what we're arguing is that there's a demographic legacy that said Israeli Jews will remain almost half the population. And you can't just say to them, well, you're not allowed to identify the way you want to. You're simply an ethnic group or a religious group that has to fit into the way we Palestinians define it. That's a recipe for the same kind of intercommunal violence and civil wars that you see in post-colonial countries all over the global south. And there's a nationalist legacy as well, in that whether they should be or shouldn't be, Israeli Jews, in my view at least, are a national group. They become a national group over 70-some years of sovereignty. And so the trick is, how do you transform political nationalism? The national, think of Orban in Hungary, or Putin, or, this is really mainly an Eastern European thing, but think of Modi in India as well. How do you transform a nationalism, whether it's a cultural, a nationalism or a religious nationalism like Hindu nationalism, from a political form of nationalism that says we want control, we want to rule, the country belongs to us, into a cultural nationalism. So what we're saying is Palestinians and Israelis can have meaningful cultural national lives. They can have museums, they can have universities, they can have their literature, their language, their heritage, they're in their homeland and so on, but within the framework of Zatar, of the civil state, right? And that's really the huge argument that's going on today. Will this be one democratic Palestinian state in which Israelis are reduced true to equal citizenship, but simply to kind of an ethnic status that they will not accept, that could lead to conflict? Or is it going to be a one democratic civil state in which Zatar has sovereignty, Zatar has the authority to rule, the country belongs to its citizens, and then the national groups are reduced within that to cultural expressions rather than national. So, that's beginning. We're not at the complete treatment yet. We have the analysis. It's leading us to the political plan that's most appropriate, most workable. But there are still, I just wanted to bring you into that discussion, there are still some fundamental differences among Palestinians themselves and all of us in terms of what exactly one democratic state would mean. So I'll leave you with that, and we have some time. Actually, one more sentence. Madeline, no. One more sentence, though, and that is that what this also does, our conception of Zatar then, is that allows a new Zatarian civil society to emerge. The good thing about young people, Madeline, I'm referring to you, is that they forget fairly quickly. And I think, if there's one country and the economy is good and people are really living together and beginning to interact with each other and so on, that then people are going to find their daily life will not be as, and they'll have their cultures. They can be a part of it, but there'll be a daily shared life at the workplace, in school, in the movie theaters, in the malls, in the, in the discotheques, in the bars and so on, in the sports world. There'll be a daily life that's Zatari, right? And that's what this kind of, in other words, we have to break down these sectarian blocks. These are Palestinians and these are Israelis, and we have to try to break that down. And there's all kinds of other cross-cutting relationships. There's class relationships. I mean, for example, what I put up here was, who's going to be among the first into this civil state space? Middle-class people. I mean, all the Palestinians in high tech are going to want to work with all the Israelis in high tech. The business people come together. Today, with all the genocide and the conflict, who's normalized relations and who get along very well? The criminals. Israelis and Palestinian criminals are brothers and sisters. And they do things together and they coordinate and and the security people, the Mukhabarat, the Palestinian side, and the security on the Israeli side. If you go, and people have talked about it, you go to a peace conference, right, in Sharm el-Sheikh, or a peace conference with Israelis and Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority is in this corner, besides after negotiation in the evening, they're in this corner. The Israeli delegation is in this corner. And right here by the fireplace, on the couches with their martinis, are the security people. The Palestinian security military people and the Israeli security military. So in other words, there's all kinds of cross-cutting relationships here that we have to take into account. Again, the younger generation, that just wants to get on with their lives, right? So that what I'm saying is our conception of this one civil state also releases the possibility of people getting out of their sectarian worlds into a wider society and then integrating, this is the final part of our program, integrating into the wider Arab world. Because the wider Arab world is not a world of nation states. It's a world of a cultural Arab nationalism in a way, a cultural Arab world that Palestinians can then join, but not really from within the framework of an ethno-state. So now, all right, Madeline.
I know we're getting later, but did you want to take a question or two? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So we have 2 microphones we can bring around if a couple people have questions.
I'd like to expand on my brother. You talked about Turtle Island.
Yes.
And I think nobody got the concept. We don't have different nations here. We're all one people. My brother, he's from the Minonaakwhe speaking people, as we call the Cree speakers, so on and so forth. I am the Haga, which English call the Mohawk, but also Haudenosaunee. We don't have the concept of owning land. So this is all,
that's right.
They could take a lesson from our people, even though we went through that colonization, where they came over and raped and killed our people. But we're still all one. We can go down to the southern part of the states. There are aunts and uncles, our children, our grandparents. We're all one. My wife was down there years ago, and she said, "Make wish to a Hopi man." He said, "Oh, thank you, sister." That's all the way down there. He knew what she was saying. So I just wanted to put that across. People have a better understanding.
Another whole discussion should be decolonizing globally, because I think this is the sense of things.
That's, so.
Should I call it? All right. Here and then.
What would it take to pave the way for buy-in from the people who are in power now to want this?
In power in Israel, you mean?
Yes. What would the advantage be for the colonizing power? Why would they want this?
They won't want it.
Then
They're
they-
not a part of it.
Right, so how would you imagine
Okay.
paving the way for that to happen?
All right. You know, in Palestine, we take a lot of inspiration from the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. It's not the same struggle, but again, settler colonial processes have a lot of similarities, and there's a lot to learn from each other. And I think the South African case is the closest case of settler colonialism to Zionism. Now there, the ANC, the African National Congress, Mandela and gang, faced the same dilemma. The whites who who had taken 89% of the land, who had the government, who had the military, who had the economy, who had the power, you're absolutely right. We're not going to dismantle the apartheid system. Why would they? I mean, they have all those things, you know. They have their villas, they have their safe neighborhoods, their lawns. Why would they wouldn't want to. The colonists are not going to voluntarily decolonize, dismantle the very system that gives them their privileges. And so the ANC understood that. You know, so Mandela didn't waste his time, even though he was in prison, he didn't waste his time knocking on the doors of white people, trying to explain to them why apartheid is unjust and why he'd still be knocking on doors. Instead, he understood that, and what the ANC did is they bypassed the whites. They just bypassed them. They said, you know, now what they did do, which was very important, and this is something that Palestinians are thinking about, is that the ANC, and this is where the indigenous are very different from the colonizers. The colonizers, it's interesting, think in terms of exclusivity and taking and everything else. The indigenous all over the world, it's almost I think it's maybe a universal, suffered genocide, dispossession, humiliation, everything we've talked about, and they're always willing to say, but you can stay. The Palestinians are saying to the Israelis, you can stay in the country. You can have equal rights. They make these gestures of acceptance and inclusion to those that oppress them in a way that the oppressors would never do. You know, so that what the ANC did, the black Africans living under apartheid, issued the Freedom Charter in 1955 that said, we're all South Africans. Right? That was one of Mandela's famous statements. We're all South Africans. Our vision of the new South Africa after apartheid is inclusive. Now, that obviously didn't convince the whites, because still, they had their privilege. But so what did they do? They bypassed them and they went to us. All of us of a certain age, and there's a few of us in the crowd here, we're all involved in the anti-apartheid movement. It was a worldwide movement, and it changed governments. And the BDS was effective. When Ford Motor Company pulled out of South Africa, no corporation wanted to be soiled by association with apartheid. So that there was a global movement, and for all kinds of reasons. Not only that, I would say we, in a sense, caused the South African regime to collapse. When that happened, because of the Freedom Charter, and because of the new constitution that showed the white people that in fact they were a part of the new South Africa, that the struggle had been against apartheid, not against them, they went through, maybe grudgingly, but peacefully through the transition from apartheid to democracy. You know, the word, we all have our code words. The word in South Africa among the whites was bloodbath. When apartheid ends, it's going to be a bloodbath. That was for years, never happened. It was, now there's all kinds of issues we're not going to get into with what did happen, especially economically, but politically the transition went. And I think that's what we have to replicate in Palestine, Israel. We have to ignore the Israelis. Israeli Jews are not going to be a part of this. And there's no reason why they should. They're not going to be a part of it. Now the question is, will the Palestinians undergoing genocide? Now I have to say, every South African that was involved in the apartheid struggle that I've talked to have said it's much worse in Palestine than it was in South Africa. The violence is worse, the repression is worse, the genocide, there wasn't a genocide from that point of view in South Africa. The South African Air Force never bombed Soweto. You didn't assassinate the leaders of the ANC and of the other liberation groups like Palestinians are being assassinated. There were some, but the ANC was still able to function. There's no Palestinian resistance organization that can generally function in Palestine in any way. And so can the Palestinians issue a freedom charter? Can the Palestinians say to Israelis, our vision, and this is what we're trying to say, but again, we don't have consensus on that, our vision of the new Zatar is inclusive of all of us. It's not fair. A lot of Palestinians will say, justly, what? Why should we, the oppressed, have to assure our oppressors that they'll be safe and included and equal if they agree to end their oppression? That's not fair, and it's not fair. But that's sometimes a gesture that has to be made, and indigenous people are able to do that in a way that it's hard for us to understand how they do that. And so if I think we all, but the big difference was that the ANC had an end game. It was always one person, one vote. That was the end game. And we all knew why we were BDSing, what we were boycotting, what the political demand was. So if the clerk would come to Mandela and say, let's do power sharing, all these weird things that we talked about before, power sharing, separate houses of parliament. Mandela would say, I'm sitting in jail until there's one person, one vote. We don't have that in Palestine. The Palestinians do not have, and this isn't an accusation because there's very real reasons why this hasn't happened, but there is no Palestinian endgame. The Palestinian Authority, which is the official voice, according to governments, is still talking about the two-state solution. Arafat, in 1988, changed the Palestinian struggle from an anti-colonial struggle to a conflict resolution. Arafat did that. So that that's the real problem we're facing, because you're mobilized. I mean, look at all the groups here. You're mobilized for Palestine. But what can you do? You can demand divestment. You can demand a ceasefire now. You can talk about Palestinian rights. You can demand your government not send military goods to Israel. All this stuff, but you can't advocate. You can't go to your government and say, this is the demand of the Palestinians, and this is what we want the Canadian government to do. And that's right now the fatal flaw in what we're doing. And that's why we're trying to work hard with the One Democratic State campaign to insert a political end game, a political program, so that when you mobilize, you're also mobilized politically to change. Just like the ANC managed to change government policy, the FLN in Algeria, just to not Go on. The FLN in Algeria. This is at the height of the Cold War. A Muslim country with a strong communist party and Islamic parties. A Muslim struggle of liberation against a French. Algeria wasn't a colony in a sense. Algeria was a part of France. You know, if you looked at the map of France, there was France and Algeria. You know, the FLN, the National Liberation Front, sent its best people abroad. And you know what they did? Think of this, John Foster Dulles, the height of the Cold War. The FLN got the United States, the Soviet Union, and China at that time together in the United Nations to condemn and sanction France, that was a NATO member, to sanction France for its military suppression of Algeria. That's possible, but it's only possible with an end game. And that's what we have to provide. Without that, we're not a political player. And with that, I think, then we can cause the Israeli apartheid regime to collapse. And then we can create a situation like in South Africa where the Israeli Jews, maybe not happily, but they'll have no choice but to make that transition. So it's a long answer, but in fact, we can't make the liberation of Palestine or the achievement of a just resolution dependent on whether Israeli colonists agree or don't agree. We have to neutralize them and create a political dynamic that's independent of them.
Hello. I was going to mention South Africa, so quickly, if you can, do you have an idea of the timeline? They don't have a Mandela. Their one leader in prison, for some reason I've forgotten his name.
Mustafa
Thank you.
Marwan Barghouti.
Yeah, the one that's the unifier. So unfortunately, they don't have also a man that's present now who's talking about how the need is to heal. And I think Mandela talked about feeling sorry for the people who had hate in their system and their fear that led them to. So in a way, the victim can take a moral high ground. And I think that helped them. So I'm just wondering, that's taken a long time. And South Africa talking now says they have to heal first. And they need the leaders from within. And I'm really impressed with the people in the Palestinian Authority, the UN, and Dr. Mansour. So who do you think, and how do you think in a timeline this might happen?
It's hard. I think it's very doable. You know, Israel's really in a state of collapse. What I say to the Palestinians is this, you know, because most Palestinians, if they're not in the refugee camps, you know, are sitting, you know, under Israeli soldiers. Their houses are being demolished. They're powerless, traumatized. Everything's been taken away from them. They see Israel as a superpower. And one reason why they're reluctant to get involved politically in the one-state campaign, they all accept the idea of one state, but they say it's utopian. We're not going to beat Israel, you know. And so what we try to say to them is, Israel is not as strong as you think it is. Israel's strong with governments. I wrote another book called War Against the People that explains that, why Israel has made itself very useful, especially in military security surveillance things, to governments all over the world. But that support is shallow. It's lost in the court of public opinion. You know, the people of Canada, I think the peoples of the world have shifted very radically towards the Palestinian cause. So Israel's not as strong, and you see the collapse. You know, the high-tech industry in Israel is in a state of collapse. Israel's international credit rating has been degraded. You know, people are leaving the country. There's really a sense of panic in Israel. There's a famous saying that we have, the last one out of Ben Gurion Airport, please turn off the light. So there is that, it's vulnerable. But where are the Palestinians? There is no Palestinian voice in the political realm. There is nobody saying one state, anything. There's a silence. And that's what is defeating, I think. If there was a Palestinian organized voice, then I think this could collapse fairly quickly, actually. I think it's all in place, but you've got to have that Palestinian leadership and voice, because they have to be the one to determine the struggle. So I think it could happen very quickly. But again, the problem is that the Palestinians are under much more suppression than the ANC was. So for example, people always ask, well, where's the Palestinian Mandela? I can give you the names of at least 100 Palestinian Mandelas that I know personally, from the age of 12 to maybe the age of 80 something, right? But the minute they show that they're Mandelas, I mean, right now they're active locally, they're active in their community, they're active. But the minute they begin to emerge as leaders, they're going to be killed or put in prison, like Marwan has been in prison now for 20-some years. So that's the problem. The leadership is there, but Israel nips it in the bud in a way that in South Africa that didn't happen. And then, of course, they're dispersed. So they have a tremendous struggle just to get to a point where they can begin to have a leadership and an organization and a program. So that's what's going to take time. Once that's in place, I believe the Israeli regime could be caused to collapse in a fairly short time, actually.
Okay, we're running out of time, so maybe we'll just take one more question. Okay, Chris.
I think the solution is there. And the solution comes from recognizing that before settler colonialism began in North America, there was settler colonialism in Ireland. And before, contemporaneously with the settler colonialism in Ireland, there was settler colonialism of a kind in Scotland too. Most of the first settlers in this country, in this part of the country, came from Ireland and Scotland. And they didn't come because they thought it would be a nice place to go on holiday. They came because there was no way of making a living in their own country, because their own land in their own country had been taken from them by a process almost indistinguishable from settler colonialism. The same thing happened in England. And that is where the whole system begins in about the 1450s, with the dispossession of the communally owned, the communal owners of the land. The people who owned the land, and you find the same thing in Palestine, the people who actually owned the land in Palestine were the people who cultivated it. I mean, there were all sorts of laws and so on and so forth, but the people who ran the Palestinian agricultural economy were the people who lived in the villages. And they did so communally, in exactly the same way as in this country, the native people, the indigenous people, they owned the land communally. They had no conception of private ownership of the land. The same thing was true of England. The same thing was true of the famous agricultural system of collective, the three-field system or the four-field system that they had in England. Now what happened was that the land was taken from the people, and that was the beginning of imperialism, the modern imperialist era. And we're watching now the end of the imperialist era. The modern imperialist era began in the 15th century in England, spread through South and North America and so on and so forth. And it begins with the deprivation of the land from the people who cultivated it. And that's set perfect.
I don't see where it's ending.
Well, I think it's ending now.
Because we're becoming globalized.
Imperialism, it's not globalized though. Imperialism is coming to an end. Imperialism is, when you talk about the strength of the government in Israel, and Palestinians thinking this government is impossibly strong, you're right. But the governments for which the Israeli state is enslaved, client of, and so on and so forth, are the imperialist governments. It's the government of the United States and Canada. It's the NATO powers that are and always have been sustaining the Israeli government. And when that imperialist project begins to collapse, and I believe it has begun to collapse, and we see it in the emergence of multipolarity and the BRICS phenomenon and the whole.
BRICS is also India.
Yeah, it's India, but it's India despite its ideology.
Right.
It's India because India is still under the shadow of colonialism. It still has to liberate itself from the colonial system, from imperialism. It's not a sub-imperialism. And I think it's obviously a long, long story, but I don't think you need to worry. I think that, you know, as Marx said, history repeats itself the second time it's fast. Well, what you see in Israel is the most farcical expression of settler colonialism that you could possibly run across. It makes the settler colonialism in Canada or the United States look fairly benign by comparison. These people really believe their own publicity. You don't imagine for a moment that the Ma and Pa going west in the covered wagon actually.
Chris, sorry to cut
Okay,
you off.
let me just say one word, and that is that it might be true what you're saying. I don't agree, but it doesn't just happen. Imperialism is ending. You know, Zionism. You know, sometimes you'll have Palestinians that'll say, well, you know, the Crusaders are here for 100 years, you know, and they left. The Crusaders were here. No, there was a Salah ad-Din. I mean, there was an agency, and so that's why we have to insist on the term struggle, because it doesn't happen. I mean, we can't rely on the fact that people will wake up and now we're getting human rights concepts and now this and that. No, there still has to be agency and struggle at its point. But Vietnam didn't just end. I mean, there was agency.
Yeah, of course, they struggled.
So, all right, thank you very much for having me. I hope it was